Professor Carophyte here to begin chapter 26, the colonization of land. So we're going to talk now about some diversity of organisms, starting with the invasion of the land in the Paleozoic era. So let's begin. So just to put things in perspective, the first things to invade land, well, were probably cyanobacteria and some protists early on, but then around 440 or so million years ago during the Silurian, this is part of the Paleozoic, we have some of the oldest land plants known. The fossils are found in the Silurian, and later on in the Paleozoic we have the first forests, so that by the end of the Permian we have forests that have a lot of trees that you might recognize today, like conifers, like kind of like pines. Maybe not the exact species we have now, but trees you would recognize by the end of the Paleozoic when we had that massive Permian extinction. Okay, so life before this point was aquatic, and coming out of the water onto land is pretty difficult. If you think about it, in the water, you know, well, it's always wet. You don't have to worry about dehydration. You don't have to fight gravity because you're always floating, right? You don't have to deal with drying out from the wind, things like that. But on land, it's hot, it's dry, there's solar radiation, it's windy, gravity is a problem. So there's a lot of adaptations, including how are you going to get oxygen and all that sort of stuff. You have to find adaptations for if you're going to crawl out of the water. And the first life on land, like I said before, probably cyanobacteria, so photosynthesizing bacteria and some protists. But eventually land plants started invading, and by 385 million years ago we have what we might call the first forests on Earth. Now we're going to focus on some of those first big multicellular eukaryotes that invaded land, the fungi and the plants. And the animals soon followed. But I want to point out before we go there that this chapter focuses on fungi and plants, but be reminded they are distantly related. A lot of times they get lumped together as similar organisms, but fungi and animals share a more recent common ancestor with each other than either one does with plants. In fact, both plants and animals share something in common. They share the fact that they are heterotrophs. They eat other organisms for food, whereas plants are autotrophs, right? Very different. So plants, let's do an introduction here. What is a plant? If you had to define it using scientific terms, you might come up with a definition like this one from your book. They're multicellular, so that leaves out all unicellular stuff. They're eukaryotic, photosynthetic autotrophs, right? And they have cell walls made of cellulose, and they have chloroplasts that contain chlorophyll A and B. Those are just two different kinds of chlorophyll that absorb slightly different wavelengths at their lambda maxes. Now, these traits that I've listed here are also shared by a few kinds of algae, specifically a kind of green algae that sounds like my name, the Carophytes. Now, the Carophytes are a group of green algae that have many of these same characters here. I think all of the same characters that we see here with plants. In fact, we think that land plants evolved from Carophyte ancestors. Now, plants also have some derived traits that they don't share with those algal ancestors, and I'm going to go into these, but they include the alternation of generations life cycle. They have multicellular dependent embryos, spores with walls that are made of sporopollenin, which is a protective like spacesuit, that are formed in structures called sporangia, and plants grow by the elongation of apical meristems. There's a weird word for you. We'll get to each of those words pretty soon. So let's start with the Carophytes. There's some Carophytes. They're the closest relative to living land plants. And just to keep in mind, let me go back there. Keep in mind we're talking about plants, land plants. Right here we can see the clade of land plants. There they are, sister with one of the groups of algae, green algae called the Carophytes. They probably evolved from Carophyte ancestors. And so they're distantly related to other green algae and other red algae, but they're most closely related to those Carophyte ancestors. And so here we can see different ways of categorizing what we call a plant at these different clades. We're going to focus on this clade right here called the Embryophytes. That's a clade that includes all land plants. That's what we're going to call the land plants. So the land plants, and they're called embryophytes because they protect their embryos, unlike the algae. Algae just have sperm and egg meet in the water, making it a zygote, or an embryo, then a zygote, and then it falls on the floor, the ocean floor or whatever, and grows into a new organism. But embryophytes, like plants, protect their embryos inside of a structure. All right. So one of the challenges for a biology student is to learn the plant life cycle. And we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but you do need to be familiar with it, and you should probably be able to draw it. Not in this detail, but you need to be familiar with the parts and pieces, and I'm going to go over it in greater detail later in the lecture. But I want to introduce to you the idea that plants have what they call an alternation of generations. So you can think about this as there are two different multicellular organisms in a plant life cycle. That's what alternation of generations means. Plants reproduce differently than humans, okay? Now what we see here is a fern life cycle. So just to show you, you might come back to this video later. So ferns have two generations. One is called the gametophyte, I'm going to circle it, gametophyte generation, and one is called the sporophyte generation. Okay, so phyte means plant. So that ending phyte means plant. So gametophyte are plants that make gametes. Sporophytes are plants that make spores. Okay, so let's just walk through this life cycle real quick, and then we can review it more later. So gametophytes grow from spores. Spores are haploid. Okay, they fall on the ground and they grow into a gametophyte. Gametophytes are also haploid because they just grew from a spore. A spore is a cell that can just grow by mitosis into an organism. Okay, but it's haploid, so it grows into a haploid organism. We haven't seen too many haploid organisms in biology so far. So this organism only has one copy of every chromosome. Now it makes sperm and egg gametes, and it does it by mitosis because the organism is already haploid. So it makes sperm and egg. They fuse together through the process of fertilization, making a zygote, which grows up to be what we call the Sporophyte generation, which is diploid. The Sporophyte generation has special organs where meiosis takes place, and in plants, meiosis produces spores, which we've already introduced ourselves to. And that is where the plant life cycle comes from. It has a diploid generation called the Sporophyte and a haploid generation called the gametophyte. So we're going to draw that later on, okay? So I'm going to end this video here, and we're going to pick up with more of those derived traits of plants in the next video.